Hi Brookings Bio students, back again for another installment in our cell parts flipbook chapter. Today we're going to talk about an important cell part called the mitochondrion. Notice plural mitochondria. Sometimes those two words are a little confusing and we have to understand where they're coming from. Remember, a lot of science words come from Latin, and in English when we want to make plurals of words we add s's to the end. So if I say I have a dog and you have a dog and together we have two dogs, English makes plurals by adding the letter s to the end of the word to make it a plural. Latin makes plurals by adding vowels to the ends of words. So the plural of mitochondrion, one mitochondrion, is not mitochondrions but mitochondria. And so I just don't want you to get confused when I see mitochondrion and think that's something different. It's just whether we're talking about one or multiple. And usually we think of cells as having many, many mitochondria, and usually we use the word, the plural form. Mitochondria are a pretty important cell part, and they look like little tiny sausages. If you've ever eaten those little Oscar Mayer cocktail sausages put barbecue sauce on them at a party or as an appetizer, they look like little sausages, and if you look closely inside, you'll see lots and lots of membranes lined up. You can see in this picture the folded membranes inside the mitochondria. Mitochondria are one of the cell parts that has a double membrane, just like the nucleus. Remember we talked about not just the bilayer with a sandwich with the heads facing out and the tails facing in. There's actually two bilayers surrounding this cell part. That would be a really good test question. Tell me a cell part that's got a double membrane, because not all cell parts do. If you look at our mitochondria now, outside outside membrane, the outer membrane going around to give us our shape, and then lots of folded inner membranes, folded inside, folded up. And that's where all the action is going to happen. That's where the chemistry is going to happen, is on that folded inner membrane. Mitochondria are also organelles that have their own DNA. That's kind of unique too. Not all organelles have their own DNA. This cell part is so important to the cell that it actually has its own DNA inside that has the code to tell it what to do, instead of waiting for the nucleus to send information out to that cell part. The folded inner membrane now inside is going to make more surface area for more chemical reactions to happen. And the interesting thing is that all of your mitochondria come from your mother, because the sperm mainly donates just the DNA to the developing the embryo, to that zygote. The cytoplasm is where all the cell parts that the embryo inherits come from, and those are inside the egg. And so even guys, if you look at the mitochondria in your cells, all of your mitochondria are inherited from your mother. What does the mitochondria do? It is the power plant of the cell. We talked in our first chapter that we did about all those molecules. We learned about glucose and ATP, and now we're going to use those molecules to help us understand what's going on inside of our cell. Glucose is our fuel. Remember we talked about if your body was a car, glucose was your fuel. If your body is a car and glucose is the gasoline, then mitochondria are the engine to burn that gasoline for you. So they're going to burn the glucose that comes from the food. We get it from our blood. Cells pick up the glucose, and then the mitochondria in the cells are going to burn the glucose and release the energy that's stored in our sugar, and take that energy and use it to charge up our ATP. Remember we talked about sticking on the P's to charge up ATP, kind of like a rechargeable cell phone battery. And the power to do that comes from burning our food. So the mitochondria are the ATP factory for the cell. So let's get something in our flip book. Put your slideshow aside, and we're going to be filling in the mitochondrial page Mitochondria have a double membrane. And they're one of the few cell parts that have a double membrane, and they also have their own DNA. That also would be a really good test question. Tell me a cell part that has its own DNA besides the nucleus. Mitochondria are the power plants of the cell. They burn glucose, and they store the energy that's released as ATP. And that folded inner membrane, now remember double membrane, outside and outer membrane, and that folded membrane inside is called the cristae. Notice that vowels at the ends again. That's telling us that it's a plural. And cristae make more surface inside the cell. That's where all the chemical reactions are going to happen to burn our sugar and to make our ATP, is inside the mitochondria. Okay, let's see if we can put our flipbook aside and see if we can color some mitochondria in our cell picture. So if you look now, we're going to start with our animal cell and pick a color. You got to remember we're color coding this, so you got to pick a color you haven't used yet. And they look like little ovals in the cell. I can tell mitochondria by looking for those folded cristae membranes inside. There's one here. There's one here. If you're coloring, don't so totally fill in the insides that you can't see what's inside there, because we're going to color another cell part later, and being able to see what's inside that little oval shape is going to help us decide what cell part it is. So I see 3 mitochondria in my animal cell. If you look in your plant cell, there's another cell part that looks kind of similar in shape, kind of oval shape. And so the way we're going to tell them apart is to look inside. If you look here, this is another mitochondria. It's got the folded cristae just like the ones over in the animal cell did. Look here though, this is another cell part, and it's kind of oval shape. And it's got some stuff inside, but it looks different than the mitochondrial shape. Inside, you can see the stripes connecting all these little stacks, and these little stacks looks like little pennies all stacked up inside. That is a different cell part. Even though it kind of has the same outside shape, it's a little bigger than the mitochondria in this picture. And this is a chloroplast. We're going to talk more about chloroplasts in a coming slideshow. So let's just color the mitochondria. There's one here. And remember the cristae inside. There's one here. And here's another one of those mitochondria. See the difference between the cristae and those stacks of pennies inside? This is another chloroplast. Don't color that one. Here's a mitochondria here. And there's one here. Don't color that guy in the middle. There's one over here. I think I got them all. What about bacteria? Look in your bacteria cell. Do you see any mitochondria? Remember, mitochondria are made out of membranes. And the definition of a prokaryote, remember bacterial cells are prokaryotes, they don't have any organelles that are made out of cell membranes inside the cell. And so bacteria don't have mitochondria. Does that mean they can't burn glucose and make their ATP? No, they just do it in their cytoplasm. They don't have a special compartment like we do for collecting the energy from sugar and burning our sugar and making ATP. They do it right in the cytoplasm. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow and talk about one more cell part, and that's ribosomes. We mentioned ribosomes earlier in our slideshow when we talked about our nucleolus making RNA for ribosomes. And ribosomes are a pretty important cell part. They're made out of proteins, and that RNA, ribosomal RNA, is coming from, the ribosomal RNA is coming from our nucleolus, right? That's where we're making the RNA that builds ribosomes. Ribosomes are the protein factories for the cell that join the amino acids together to make those protein chains. Remember, we learned about this cell part in our last chapter. That's an amino acid. It's got that amino group. It's got a carboxyl group. That R group, that's the clue for the rest of our molecule here. And those little pieces, remember, those are subunits, our monomer subunits that we're going to use to join together to make those chains of amino acid, amino acid, amino acid, amino acid to make a protein. And the cell part that's joining those, that's doing dehydration synthesis, remember, to pull out a water molecule and join the little pieces, that is the ribosomes. Ribosomes can be found in several places inside the cell. They can be attached to what we call the rough ER, and we're going to talk about rough ER in a minute, in our next slideshow, sorry. Or they can be free floating, free in the cytoplasm, and it kind of depends on what kinds of proteins they're making. If they're going to be making proteins to be used inside their cell, perhaps it's an enzyme to do a chemical reaction, some kind of cytoskeleton protein. They are just loose floating in the cell, making their proteins and putting them into the cytoplasm. If it's going to be a protein that is transported out of the cell, for example, insulin, then those ribosomes are going to attach to the rough ER and insert the proteins that they're making into the spaces inside the rough ER. We're going to talk more about that in our next slideshow. So let's get some information down about ribosomes. They can be free in the cytoplasm or attached to the rough ER. So it kind of depends on what kind of proteins they're making. They're made out of proteins and RNA, those two building block molecules. Remember, we talked about proteins and RNA. It's a nucleic acid last chapter. Proteins and RNA, and their function is to, their function is to make proteins. So it's kind of interesting. They're made out of proteins, and they actually make the proteins for the cell. Okay, let's see if we can look in our cell picture and see if we can find some ribosomes. They look like tiny little polka dots. Tiny little dots. And I'm going to ask you to pick a kind of a darker color to be your ribosomes, because ribosomes can be attached to the ER, and if we make them really light, and then when we try to color our ER in our next slideshow, we won't be able to see them very well. So I'm going to ask you to pick a dark color. And all of these little tiniest polka dots are ribosomes, the little tiniest ones. And they're free floating. You can see them floating in the cytoplasm. You don't have to color every single little polka dot, but color enough that we can tell that there's some out there in the cytoplasm. And then these polka dots also that are attached here to this membrane are also ribosomes. So we're going to color a few that are attached and a few that are free floating. And like I said, you don't have to color every single one, but color enough that we can kind of see them. Okay, so animal cells have ribosomes. Plant cells also look for the very smallest little polka dots, free floating, and also attached. Look here, there's a piece of membrane with ribosomes attached. Plants have that big giant storage space in the center. We're going to talk about that coming up in another slideshow. So it kind of pushes all the other organelles to the sides of a plant cell. But we have some membranes here with ribosomes. There's some over here with ribosomes. And we also have some free floating ones. So remember, I said you don't have to cover every single one, but you want to color enough that you can kind of see that they can be in two places. Okay, how about our plant cell, or excuse me, our bacterial cell? If you look in your bacterial cell, you also see bacteria have ribosomes. They don't have any membranes to attach them to. They're free-floating ribosomes. But they have ribosomes also to make, I'll throw a couple more in there, to make their proteins for them. bacterial ribosomes are a little bit smaller than eukaryotic ribosomes, but they do the same job. They make proteins. They're made out of proteins and RNA, and they make proteins for the cell. Well, thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more cell parts coming in our next show.